Okay, today is a first actually, because it's the first time we've had two speakers. And as usual, my introductions are going to be brief and to the point. His Life of Disease, John McGowan and Cooke, thank you very much. Let's go.
Okay, it's very nice having been on the other side of the other side of this table on quite a number of occasions here to be up here and to see a number of very familiar faces in the crowd, including another familiar face who just walked through the door. Now, the title that we're talking to tonight is Life of Disease. Both myself and Anne work at Canterbury Christ Church University, which is over in East Kent. We don't work quite that far, but we're both clinical psychologists and we teach on the regional clinical psychology training scheme, just to give you some idea of our own professional background. So I thought really I'd come in with just trying to think, this chap is looking quite worried and he's reading a book. And it's a book of diagnoses. And what's he worrying about? Okay, maybe he eats too much, maybe he's a bit forgetful, maybe he's a bit of a slacker. I don't know about you, I'm kind of all these things, really. But it turns out that this book offers a diagnosis for each of these things. Does he have binge eating disorder? Does he have mild neurocognitive disorder? So, not quite dementia, but just being a bit forgetful. Is he a bit of a slacker? Adult attention deficit disorder. I think we may return to that. We had an interesting conversation about that before we came, and hopefully we'll return to that at some point. Maybe he's worried about somebody else. Here's a picture of a child in a rage. What's wrong with this child? Oppositional defiant disorder. Hostility and defiant behaviour towards authority figures. Or maybe disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, temper outbursts that are grossly out of proportion in intensity or duration to the situation. Now, a number of people here have children, I think, possibly the majority. Just a show of hands, does anyone have children who don't display behaviours like this? Oh, the hand sort of sneaked up there from probably too young to have children. If you don't, I'll swap you. The little girl in that picture is now a much bigger girl, and these things have only become more prevalent, and I would like to say that I would be worried if they were unique to her, but it turns out they're not. Most of her friends seem to do the same sorts of things. Okay, what book is he reading? The book he's reading is this. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, what is this? I'll just run through this. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is the full title, colloquially known as the DSM. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association and basically offers quite detailed criteria for diagnosing behaviours, experiences, feelings, as illnesses or mental disorders. The language of mental disorders is pretty prevalent. I suppose often, maybe slightly less pejoratively, we would refer to them as mental health problems. It's currently in its 5th version. This version was released at the end of May, if memory serves, and it's been more than a decade in the making. This is a big deal, more like 14 years actually. It's a really big thing. It's the 5th edition. And one of the things that has raised hackles, there's been a lot of coverage about this. I'm guessing that many of you have come across this coverage as you're here at all. But one of the real primary areas of anxiety provoked by this has been its ever-increasing scope. And a little bit more disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. There we go. There's a slightly more detailed criteria for a very cross-looking child, and one of the reasons that cross picture of my daughter was there as a baby was because I can't really get cross pictures of her. Now she won't stand for it. Because that's slightly more grown up cross child, and a set of criteria which would suggest disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Now, the increased scope of this has raised some concern. Alan Francis, psychiatrist and editor of the DSM-5, for some reason they've dropped the Roman numerals. Up to 4 they had Roman numerals. He has suggested that the publication of version 5 was a sad day for psychiatry. Why? Because he feels, a whole bunch of other people feel, that this new manual has the potential to over-pathologise human behaviour, ordinary experience. what's over-pathologising, what's not. That's hopefully something that we're going to get into tonight. So there's been lots of articles. This one had quite an eye-catching headline, abnormal is the new normal. Why over half the US population will have mental disorders according to this, according to these criteria. So there's been quite a lot of good and interesting journalism, even though some of it is, eye-catching headlines. And I think what we'd like to think about and talk about tonight really is this overreach? Is it overreach, and is it a problem? And rather than saying, is this specifically an overreach or does it over-pathologise things, I think the way we'd like to take it is to just think about the pros and cons of psychiatric diagnosis, of offering mental illness labels, and just think about the pros and cons of that a little bit more widely. Now, what we'll talk about just the general idea of mental illness. I'll trip over this chair if I keep moving it. The idea of mental illness, and also the ways in which diagnosing experiences according to that lens, might be helpful. People have hugely strong views about this, from very pro to very anti, but hopefully just try and give a bit of coverage to both sides of that. And some of the problems with mental health diagnosis, labelling, the concept of illnesses or disorders about these, in these kind of categories. Okay. Just before we wade right in, I'd just like to just have a couple of slides, just a little digression on history. And there have been many different ways to describe, madness or emotional struggles or experiences that, seem maybe out of the norm across human history. The Greeks had ideas of, imbalances of the humours. Pretty much everyone said spiritual explanations, one way and another, still prevail in a number of parts of the world. There's a really interesting kind of narrative that, as far as I can see, stems from around the time of the Reformation, of a kind of moral failings. You're sad, you're not really coping, moral degeneracy. Think of paintings like, the Rake's Progress. The Rake has a dissipated lifestyle, he ends up in Bedlam. Or Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Being good, being worthy, being moral, that was a sign that, you were a good, upstanding moral person and would kind of get to heaven. So there's been quite a strong narrative about moral failings, and I think it's still there. I'll sort of illustrate why in a bit, but I think that's still kind of sloshing around in a low-key way. More dominant paradigm, brain stroke disease problem, diseases that are kind of located in imbalances in your brain. I think that really stems from the scientific Enlightenment. There's been all sorts of woo-woo theories, phrenology, bumps in your head and things like that. Sometimes debatable whether, biological theories have any more veracity now, but we'll come to that as well. And also there's kind of something else sloshing around, emotional trauma. The notion that you've had tough experiences or been abused or neglected or, traumatised in some way. And that's been kind of sloshing around with increasing force probably since the latter part of the 19th century. Freud and obviously the whole growth of psychotherapy, different sorts of psychotherapies. Now, we don't have time for this in detail, but just a few kind of key takeaways from that, I think. I would like the whole talk to be about the history of mental health and mental illness, because I think it's pretty interesting. But we have other fish to fry tonight. Okay, the descriptions of distress, I think, really reflect their time and the culture that they come from as well. So I think they reflect the assumptions of the time and the prevailing ways of thinking of the time. I think it's worth remembering that. And DSM type diagnoses, and there's another, the International Classification of Diseases, which is kind of the official European system, they reflect some of the assumptions of our time. And I think that may well become a little bit more evident as we go on. But they also reflect vested interests. Now, vested interests, most common vested interests that are cited are things like drug companies or healthcare providers. If you can frame something as a sickness, then you can flog the cure. So, people may come up with good solutions, but they have a particular vested interest in seeing something a particular way. So, new illnesses, new markets. We had a discussion before we came about what the illnesses in the DSM were that were the biggest ticket potential money earners, and we can return to that later. But also vested interest, I think, families, people who use services, they all may have feelings to bring to the table as well, and sometimes those may help things, and sometimes one might question a little bit more what the agendas of us, essentially. You know, people who are the consumers of these labels, the consumers of, you know, pharmaceuticals, the consumers of psychotherapy. What we bring to the table may sometimes skew things as well. Okay, so I'll try and just rattle through, before handing over to Anne, I'll rattle through some of the helpful bits. Okay, this is a couple of quotes from David Cooke, who is the lead editor of the DSM, the new edition of the DSM. He says it represents the strongest classification system currently available. Some people might say that that's, you know, not a hotly contested field. But, you know, he clearly believes in it. And he said, you know, it's a guidebook. It's a guidebook to help physicians describe their patients. So it's all very much doctors and patients and illness and maybe well. But, you know, he talks a lot about this. He's written quite a lot about this. He was over in Britain recently engaging in some debates about it. And he's very committed, I think, to the ideology behind this. Now, those helpful bits are, you know, in theory anyway, it provides boxes to put things in. You've got a certain kind of set or constellation of symptoms. You are, you know, depressed or schizophrenic or some variation of those labels. So you can see how that is potentially helpful. And it provides criteria. I'm about to publish something on our departmental blog from a young psychiatrist who said, you know, DSM is irrelevant to me, we just do it by feel. If you're sad, we give you a pill. Now, I certainly don't think he's speaking for all psychiatrists in that at all, but I'd probably be a little bit more reassured if someone was actually thinking about detailed criteria rather than just flying by the seat of their pants. Now, I think it gets a little bit more interesting is it frames these things as illness. Now, there's all sorts of tricky problems with that, but I also think that there are some helpful elements too. And I was just trying to think off the top of my head of just a couple of examples. I'm sure that many of you may have examples of your own. One of the ones I was thinking of was shell shock and the First World War. It was viewed in a pretty pejorative way, really. Many of you will have read, you know, Regeneration by Pat Barker. And just the notion that rather than being, you know, cowardly or weak, that somebody was actually ill. To me, that's a step forward. And, you know, so that moral failings kind of narrative or moral weakness narrative is still kind of floating around then. And actually framing something as illness, I think, is a real sort of step forward in terms of opening up, you know, compassionate response, really. The second one is someone with a drink, and this pertains to just a personal example from my own life. My own first encounter with a sort of psychiatric label. An uncle of mine in Ireland was a big boozer, and it was characterised to me as a child. He was sick, that was it. He was an alcoholic, he was ill. Now, even as sort of 9 or 10, it didn't quite add up to me. You know, my cousins, who are a bit older than me, had a pretty shit time, actually, but, you know, it was kind of okay because he was sick. You know, there wasn't all quite adding up. But I think the broader point is it allowed certainly my family and the culture around him to get in touch with a compassionate response towards him. I mean, he wasn't a wastrel or a slacker, or, you know, he was sick. And that seemed to be a step forward. Okay. And that's still sloshing around now. Stephen Fry recently had quite a well-publicised, where he talked about suicidal feelings, and there was a bit of stuff flying around in the papers and the internet where, ooh, what's he got to be down about? You know, he's rich and successful and blah, blah. Alistair Campbell tweeted, to those asking what Stephen Fry has to be depressed about, would you ask what someone has to be cancerous, you know, diabetic or asthmatic about? You know, back off, the guy's sick. You know, don't judge him, he's sick. And that message is very, very much there in Time to Change, big campaign against stigma and discrimination for people with mental health problems. These problems are absolutely real, absolutely as real as a broken arm. That's what they say on their website. And when you get to, you know, when you use labels such as this, it does allow you, whether meaningfully or not, to focus treatment. So drugs, psychotherapy, sick arrangements from work, special educational help, you know, for things like autism or dyslexia. So, you know, essentially it allows you to focus help. However, that's the good cop bit. I'm going to hand you over to Anne, who I think is going to just challenge a little bit more some of these assumptions.
He's the good cop. I guess that makes me the bad cop. Oh well, somebody had to do it. Okay, so
you can elbow me in the face as much as you like.
So yeah, it's my job to tell you, just to kind of outline some of the problems as we see it. You'll probably gather we're not sort of pushing a particular view, really. We're just sort of opening up, we're trying to kind of open up the issues for debate, really, because it's an issue of debate, and hopefully we can have one later. So yeah, some of the potential problems with seeing things as illness. So, well, here we go. We are seeing them as an illness. To have a diagnosis does presume that there is an illness, and a mental illness, I guess. And I guess it focuses our attention on the brain. The idea that there might be something wrong with the brain that's possibly causing it, or maybe at least implicated in some way. So here's some very strong messages. John was talking earlier about the kind of vested interest, and I think it's interesting that a lot of public information about mental health is, I guess, inevitably by parties with vested interest. We've all got, I guess, a vested interest in one way or another. Obviously, the pharmaceutical companies have a big financial vested interest in us believing the kind of narrative that these problems are illnesses that can be remedied with their products. I guess, that's what they're there for, so it shouldn't be surprising. So this is from the Prozac.com website, which is one of Eli Lilly's website. Eli Lilly is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, probably one of the biggest companies in the world, actually. And they say very clearly, depression is an illness with probable biological causes. Well, not everybody would agree with that, but they assert that very clearly. And similarly, this is from their another Eli Lilly product, Zyprexa, which is an antipsychotic medication. It's got its own website, Zyprexa.com, and it says very clearly at the top, schizophrenia is a devastating brain disorder. No doubt there. Okay, so just to have a think about how we might judge these kind of claims, really. And what makes a good diagnostic system, or indeed a good kind of way of thinking about things. And generally there's kind of three ways that people use to judge a system like this. Firstly, reliability. Can the experts agree that somebody is, for example, depressed or has schizophrenia? Validity. So that goes beyond just agreeing to, are we talking about real things in the world that have some kind of existence? It's meaningful to talk about. And are those things illnesses? So that's the second question. And the third question, utility. If there's a debate about number one or number two, in the end it comes down to, well, what's the most useful way of thinking about these things? So that's the kind of third way of thinking about it. And I'm just going to kind of take you through each of those in turn a little bit. So first, reliability. Do the experts agree? Well, this is something that actually has improved a lot over the years. It used to be, in the days of DSM-5, say, it used to be quite bad, very, very low rates of reliability. It's improved a lot, and you can see why, because John showed the slide earlier of, for example, dysfunctional mood regulation disorder, and you can see it's a sort of tick box, and it's all operationalised. In other words, it's very, very concrete. Do you exhibit this behaviour at such and such a level that you, for example, damage property? Such and such, so many times a year, so 3 times a year, for example. There is a new, in DSM-5, there's a new diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder, which didn't exist before, and to count for that, you have to have at least 3 episodes a year where you damage somebody with damaged property. So it's quite easy to say, is somebody in or out? You can then argue about, is it a meaningful category? But that's another argument. So, we have a lot of improvement, but still, even with training, experts, obviously it varies between diagnoses, but in general, experts only agree about half of the time. So it's not great. It's a lot better than it was, but it's not great.
So if you have a broken arm, experts are going to agree 100% of the time, or
probably
99%.
not, but,
Maybe.
Right, yeah.
It's much, much higher. Yeah.
What about a green stick fracture? There's always slight areas around the edges, but yeah. I get your point. Okay, so we're going on to the second thing, of validity. And reliable, just because something's reliable doesn't mean it's valid, doesn't mean it's a real thing, just because you can identify it and kind of describe it accurately so that somebody else can say, yeah, that's one of those. So here's a good example. This is the group in the world, completely random. This is off the top of my head because I found these on Google Images. These are people with white hair and red shoes. Okay? Hopefully we can all agree that it's relatively easy to define a group of people with white hair and red shoes. Although again, there's, this lady here has a few black bits. Does she really count? So there's always grey around the edges. But basically we can agree on the category of people with white hair and red shoes. But so what, Is that a meaningful category? As you can see, there might be in the world a wide variety of people with white hair and red shoes with absolutely nothing else in common. So, for example, we have, punk kind of scene and the Pope. So, how meaningful is that category? We can identify it more or less reliably. That doesn't necessarily mean it's reliable. That it's valid, it's a real thing. Another example. In the 17th century, everybody was pretty much agreed how you recognised and how you defined a witch. Does that mean that witches were real? Arguable. Okay. So when we come back to the subject we're talking about now, which is about mental health, what we call mental health problems, what we're really talking about, are beliefs, experiences and behaviours. These are the things that we call symptoms. There are no kind of blood tests in mental health. You can't be sent off for tests to find out that you have, for example, an imbalanced chemical, a lack of serotonin in the brain leading to depression. So these remain theories. There are no kind of independent tests. So the things that we're talking about that are referred to as symptoms are actually beliefs, experiences and behaviours that are described to a clinician or observed by a clinician. And so what makes them symptoms rather than just normal beliefs, experiences and behaviours if they're considered to be outside the normal range? And again, going back to that definition from DSM that John put up, you'll notice that it says something about, in most of the descriptions, the tick boxes, one of them will be, this is more than is usual for the person's culture, or something like that, to indicate that it's outside of the normal range. But of course, in whose judgment is it outside of the normal range? It's necessarily subjective. So, in the wife's view, he's outside of the normal range. He's too blooming happy, He needs some therapy. On a slightly more serious note, well, I don't know if it is, in the 19th century, there was this well-recognised diagnosis syndrome called drapetomania, which was the irresistible urge of slaves to run away from plantations, which was considered a psychiatric diagnosis. Also known as runaway slave syndrome. So
the guy's a doctor who invented it, so if you feel that it's real.
Pardon?
Would you call that a vested interest?
Possibly. That's all we can talk about later. So I think it's important, kind of John said at the beginning, it's important to kind of take a long view and think that what we see now as mental health problems might have been seen differently, and things might have been considered very differently, thought of very differently in different ages, and will be no doubt in 100 years' time. That's not in DSM-5, by the way. It wasn't in any of the DSM. Okay, so then coming on to validity, are these real things and are there illnesses? So again, I said they're beliefs, experiences and behaviours. They're symptoms if they're outside of the normal range. That's subjective. And then also, the other thing to say is that symptoms don't really seem to occur in predictable patterns. So you have those patterns that are kind of clearly set out in DSM, but actually when you do statistical studies looking at whether people's experiences and beliefs actually cluster in the ways that DSM suggests, are there do people tend to, who have hallucinations, tend to also have delusions, for example? They're supposed to be the classic symptoms of schizophrenia. They don't. There doesn't seem to be much statistical association. So arguably, you could say, is that then a syndrome? And then this is just a throwback to, I don't know how many of you were at Joanna Moncrief's talk, She was a psychiatrist who gave one of these talks a few months ago, and her thesis is that psychiatric medication has general effects rather than targeting specific illnesses. So, for example, it makes you feel calmer. Certain drugs make you feel calmer. That's irrespective of your diagnosis. And certainly different people with different diagnoses are often prescribed the same medication and find benefit sometimes from the same medication.
I think her thesis was that drugs fuck with your head, sometimes in helpful ways, but that the notion that they remedy a chemical imbalance is essentially bogus a lot of the time.
Well, there's certainly no evidence for it, she said, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's just a picture of...
Not German Greece, that.
No, that, as far as we know it isn't. I think it's a man, actually. Okay, so finally, we've gone through reliability and validity. And we've shown that, we're not sure about either of them. There's a debate there to be had about both, really, and hopefully we can come back to that. Utility. So is this a helpful way to think about things? There are a number of ways that we can think about these phenomena. And in the end, perhaps it comes down to what's the most helpful. Like John said, in many ways, thinking about something as an illness can be helpful. It's a lot better, in many ways, than some of the alternatives. But there are some downsides, and as bad cop, it's my job to tell you about those. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the everyday meaning of the idea of mental illness, about its practical effects, in the world, and also the psychological effects. If you get a diagnosis, what's the likely psychological effect on you? Okay, so the everyday meaning of mental illness. Professionals love to think that we are kind of educating people about what mental illness is. There is an argument that is doomed to failure because everybody thinks they know what it is, The reason we've got this slide up here is from a colleague of mine who had somebody say to him that his biggest problem in life was that I have schizophrenia is hardly a good chat-up line, is it? You can see where he was coming from. Maybe the negative associations are inherent. This is just somebody's opinion, but they think that identifying people as mentally ill makes them seem like different species, almost as alien as the witches seem to 15th century Europeans. This was one of the most famous witches, so-called Sarah Good, who was hanged in 1692. Okay, so coming away from the kind of everyday meaning, practical consequences. Avoidance and harsh treatment. This is an experiment. I don't know if you've heard of the famous Stanley Milgram obedience experiments. That's basically when an authoritative figure in a white coat tells you to give somebody electric shock, you give them electric shock. You kind of leave your conscience outside the door. And this was they are in no case were they real, I should say. They're all fake electric shocks with a stooge sitting there. But in this case, there was a slight variation on the experiment. The people were told that the people who were told that the stooge had a mental illness gave them more shocks than if they were told that they had other sorts of psychological problems.
They were trying to help them on an ECT basis.
Possibly. Possibly, yeah. They didn't come up with that theory, actually, in the paper. Okay, unemployment and financial disadvantage. I'll hurry up because I can see that time's going on. There is evidence, obviously there are very high levels of unemployment amongst people with a diagnosis of mental illness, but there is some evidence that that's not necessarily due to impairment, which is what sometimes people assume, that actually it's often due to discrimination. And so there have been studies, for example, where changing the way that somebody's problems were described and introducing an idea that it's mental illness leads to less job offers, basically. This is you.
Right. I think I'm going through to the end now. We've got just over 10 minutes more, should be more than enough. So this slide really is an attempt to represent something about what happens to these things: divorce, unemployment, homelessness, loneliness, poverty. What happens to them when you locate the problem in the person rather than in circumstances outside of the person? We like to say in services, mental health problems, they can happen to anyone. And in one way that's true. except they're much more likely to happen to you if you're poor. Really, unequal societies create more, lead to more of these kind of problems. So, what happened to these sides of things? Thinking about addressing poverty, or does that get squeezed out? I'm not sure if everything sucks because I'm depressed, or I'm depressed because everything sucks. It's a fairly light-hearted way to say it, but there's quite a profound conundrum outlined in that picture. Really, if you pay too much attention to the bit at the top, do you forget about the bit at the bottom? When I was training as a psychologist, I reckon probably about 2/3 of the people that I saw in adult mental health services were single parents living on benefits. Was there just a rash of biological imbalance among single parents living on benefits, or were people coming with the strain of the life that they were living? What happens to personal proclivities? Certain kinds of sexual practices are still there in the DSM. They can be treated if you're sad about them. But that was the trajectory around homosexuality. That's out now. But first of all, it was there. It was seen as an illness. Then it was only seen as an illness if you were sad. Now if someone was sad, I hope one would sort of try and think about what might be some of the circumstances that might contribute to that, rather than turn around and say to them, "Oh, you're clearly sad because you can't be normal." I mean, that doesn't feel very good to me. There's loss of rights among the practical consequences of this. You can be banged up against your will. You can be treated against your will. You can be given medication and electric shocks, and that doesn't really happen in other elements. Without having transgressed and gone through a process of the court. The psychological effects, often they're very negative, while it opens up a more compassionate narrative. I'm sick of that. I thought, oh, God, will I ever get out of this? Rufus May, he's quite a well-known psychologist who had some quite heavy sort of schizophrenic type experiences when he was younger, and he's written a lot about these in his career. And I think the point of this for me is that you get one of these labels. Do you ever get out of having one of these labels? You can cease to have a broken arm. You can cease to have cancer. Do you ever become not bipolar anymore? Or is everyone always looking at you through that lens forever? And are you looking at yourself through that lens forever? And what does that mean for you? The positive sides of the experience. What if we judge things to be a talent rather than an illness? Paul Merton, somebody with, who's been very public about mental health problems, some of things about him seem to flow out of a different view of the world, a different take on things. The guy down at the bottom of the brill cream is Alan Turing. Now, Alan Turing regularly appears on lists of people retrospectively diagnosed with autism, but he's probably one of the single most influential people on the trajectory of humanity in the 20th century. This is a guy who basically invented digital computing, as well as being one of the most influential people in the outcome of the Second World War. Now, his talent flew out, came out of things that we might actually judge in a negative way. Simon Baron-Cohen, who's quite a prominent autism expert, was talking about this recently, that what happens if we start to diagnose people with autism prenatally, and people don't go ahead with those pregnancies. People who actually change humanity and have changed humanity from their unique set of abilities, they're all of a sudden out of the equation. Where does that leave us? So there's an upside often to unique and different and offbeat abilities. I'm not going to say... Did you want to say something about this, Anne? We've been doing a few things we're doing a departmental blog, which there's a slide there, but there's just one article I think you just wanted to draw attention to on the following slide.
Yeah, this is just to say this is a subtle or not so subtle plug for our departmental blog, where we discuss a lot of these issues, actually. Discursive of Tunbridge Wells, we're called. There's one particular... this was one particular piece recently by somebody who's had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, talking about how excited she is that this kind of debate is happening, really, and the shame that, for her anyway, has been associated with having that diagnosis. I just wanted to read out this paragraph here. It can't erase the fact that my family has been shamed and defamed by psychiatric diagnosis. Our lives, historical and present, are forever affected by it. We have felt different. We have felt defective and unacceptable. We felt that our genes were inadequate and shouldn't be reproduced. We felt that our diagnoses had to be hidden. because others might think us dangerous or unpredictable. At times we felt so other that we had to hide our experiences even from one another. We lived with secrets and silence that reached into every corner of their lives. And just later on she talks about her parents having gone to their graves thinking that they'd given birth to defective children. Obviously that's only her take on it. It's, you know, other people might not have those associations, but I guess it was just one of the things that we wanted to point out, that it is often associated, or can be, with a sense of shame and being defective in some way.
And you may never get rid of it as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, now I wanted to say something specifically about autism, and that's particularly for this audience, actually, an audience of skeptics in the pub. And the reason I wanted to bring it illustrates some of the points and how they shake out in reality, but autism particularly because of this guy, and I know that there's some special feeling held in skeptics in the pub groups for Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who posited a link between the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, and autism. Now, just to clarify where I'm standing on this, the best evidence suggests there is no link. There is absolutely no link. There's no evidence at all really to suggest that. But I was thinking of a slightly different aspect of it, which was, how did the scare get going? His research, and certainly from what I've read, it's got stamped all over with the words, withdrawn on the Lancet website, but it does look pretty weak. But how did the scare get going? And I think one of the great impetuses behind this scare was, the autism tsunami. People talk about the autism tsunami. You Google that and you get into quite an interesting world of theories. What's the autism tsunami? This graph is a bit smoothed out, but effectively it's from an autism charity called Autism Speaks, and it really pertains to the Western world. And it's in 1975, 1 in 5,000 children were diagnosed with autism. In 2009 is the final year. 1 in 110 children were diagnosed with autism. Now, however you break that down, that's a big deal. If cancer was increasing at that rate, I think we'd probably be somewhat concerned about it. If certain other things were increasing at that rate, so it's a big. What's going on? What's going on in that graph? Well, is it MMR, the MMR vaccine? Probably not. You start trolling around, there's tons of theories, increased parental age, men and their decaying sperm as they get older. Antenatal inflammation was one that I read, unfortunately, on a website that I quite like, which is rather disappointing. Antenatal inflammation, there's so many chemicals in the water, women's uterus has become inflamed and they're giving birth to more children with autism. It seems a slightly iffy theory. But there's another way of thinking about it, really, which is, these are very complex diagnostic criteria. When you break it down, there are well over 250 distinct presentations that could meet the criteria for autism. Those criteria themselves change and have changed in different versions of the DSM. You throw into that the complexity of that we have different social expectations. Who was talking about autism in 1975? I was only 8 at the time, but I'm prepared to take a bet not that many people. Our sense of it, our awareness of it is much higher. And also talk about a vested interest, there is often an active desire to get that diagnosis. It opens the way to all sorts of educational help, and also I think it validates something about people's individual experience and struggles. So I reckon that all we can really observe is increased diagnosis, not necessarily increased prevalence. We just don't know. And I'm not sure anyone really knows for sure. The authors of that graph confidently assert at the bottom that 25% of that increase is due to changed medical judgment. How they get to that figure, I can't even imagine. They're really specific. 25% of that. The other 75% is real. How do they get there with these kind of very complex factors going on? And we really dig around, and there's no research really ultimately trying to properly tease these things out. As far as I can see, other people may know more about that, but I have yet to read anything convincing in that regard. Now, is this big increase in autism diagnosis a good or a bad thing? I don't want to make that judgment for you. I have personal experience of it being quite a positive and helpful thing, and personal experience of it being a really negative thing, both from branches of my own family. That's before even getting to working in clinical services. So I think I think it's complicated, though. It's certainly not an unalloyedly good thing. Okay, so just overall, if you can concluding remarks. Why is this whole thing about diagnosis important? I'd say it profoundly influences the way people we care about are treated when we have struggles and difficulties. There are some real scientific questions to be answered about that. And also, the other thing is, I think it leaks into our language, it leaks into our sense of ourselves. Do we talk about being sad or depressed? Do we talk about being bad or psychopathic or whatever? Do we start to talk in psychiatric labels? I was talking to a father of a child at my kid's school the other day, and his son was having some problems. He said his son was depressed. I was thinking, but I felt really uncomfortable with that. It opened something, but you could feel a lot of doors closing at the same time. All of a sudden the problem was totally located in the boy. And it didn't feel comfortable, and I think there's some interesting reasons why it didn't feel comfortable. Where does it leave us? It leaves us locating the problem in the person, like bad dad, often with a very, very biological slant. Drugs often the cure. That may partly be a product of a vested interest. Is life a disease? More and more of life is encompassed by diagnosis, despite the fact that things like homosexuality have come out of it, which is obviously great developments from, certainly I would argue. The original version of DSM from the 50s was 132 pages. The current one that's just been published is over 1,000. So the scope is really increasing. Now, many argue that this is helpful, and passions really, really run high. We're underdiagnosing things, we're not treating them enough. It's really important that we recognise things more. But there are plenty of arguments to say that this isn't always helpful either. It's complicated. Does it squeeze out other ways of thinking? Does it squeeze out ways of thinking that place more emphasis on things like social circumstances or family factors or other things? So, as a species, as a humanity, is it a good or a bad thing or a complicated thing for us to go down this route? And I think we'll stop there and let everyone get a drink and go to bed.